software company was burning millions a year on its cloud bill, whether it needed the capacity or not. So it spent a few years clawing its way out from under it. There's a name for what they did: cloud repatriation. It means pulling workloads and data back off the big cloud platforms. Amazon mostly, sometimes Microsoft or Google. Instead, the company runs that same infrastructure on hardware it owns outright, rather than renting it forever. It sounds like a step backward, but for a growing number of companies, it's turned into a line item finance actually asks about in budget meetings, not a hobby project engineers argue about in forums. For 15 years or so, the pitch was simple. Don't buy servers, rent them. Pay Amazon or Microsoft or Google by the hour, scale up when you're busy, scale down when you're not, and never think about hardware, data centers, or cooling systems again. For a lot of companies, especially ones just starting out, that pitch was genuinely great. Nobody wants to buy a warehouse full of servers before they even have customers. But somewhere along the way, for the companies that did grow, rent instead of buy quietly turned into a bill that only goes up. Storage costs, compute costs, data transfer costs, premium support tier costs, none of these show up as one big scary number. They show up as a slow, steady climb on a monthly invoice that finance eventually starts asking questions about. A 2024 IDC survey of more than 2,200 IT decision makers found that close to 80% of them were planning at least some level of repatriation of the major hyperscalers within the next 12 months. Not because the cloud stopped working, because the bill stopped making sense at scale. When you're small, renting is almost always cheaper than buying. When you're huge, with usage that's a steady and predictable month after month, renting indefinitely starts to look like a very expensive long-term lease on a house you could have bought outright years ago. Here's what leaving the cloud actually looked like for one real company, with real numbers attached to it. The team behind the project management tool Basecamp and the email service Hey, a company called 37 Signals, was reportedly paying roughly $3.2 million a year to run their products on Amazon's cloud. That's an established company with millions of users, not a startup just getting off the ground. So they made a decision a lot of people in the industry thought was reckless. They bought their own physical servers, spent roughly 2 to 3 years moving everything in-house, and walked away from AWS almost entirely. Their reported cloud-related spend has since dropped from that $3.2 million a year figure to around $1.3 million a year. 37 Signals has projected that once a storage migration, it's still in the middle of, wraps up, its cumulative savings over a roughly 5-year window will land somewhere around $10 million total. Part money already banked, part still expected. None of this proves the cloud is a bad deal. Only that steady, predictable infrastructure needs can make owning it cheaper than paying for it indefinitely. But none of those savings could start until 37 Signals got through the fee every major cloud provider charges just to let a customer's own data leave. And that toll is its own story coming up shortly. Dropbox, the file storage and sync service used by hundreds of millions of people, ran one of the biggest cloud exits anyone has ever put a real number on, nearly a decade ago now. At its peak, the company reportedly had roughly 500 petabytes of user files sitting on Amazon's cloud. Photos, documents, backups, shared folders, everything people had stored and trusted the service to keep safe. Instead of continuing to pay Amazon to store and move all of it indefinitely, Dropbox spent a few years building its own storage infrastructure from scratch, then physically migrating almost all of that data over to hardware it owned and operated itself. The result, according to the company's own reporting, about $74.6 million saved over 2 years. That's not a rounding error on a quarterly earnings call. That's a company realizing that once you're operating at a big enough scale, with storage needs predictable enough year over year, the pay-as-you-go model stops being the cheap, flexible option and silently becomes the expensive one. Dropbox could justify the enormous upfront cost of building its own data centers, precisely because it knew with real confidence roughly how much storage it was going to need next year and the year after that. Insurance giant GEICO is running its own large-scale move off rented cloud infrastructure and onto hardware it owns, a program that's still in progress, not a finished exit. Worth flagging up front, GEICO's cloud spend is reportedly split across multiple providers, and this shift generally isn't described as an AWS-specific move. It's included here as a parallel example of the same trend playing out beyond Amazon's cloud specifically. GEICO has said it's aiming to complete the broader program by around 2029 and so far has migrated more than 1,000 servers onto owned hardware. On those already migrated workloads specifically, GEICO has reported cutting its cost per unit of compute by roughly 50%, half the cost on the servers that have made the move so far. So if repatriating can save companies millions, why doesn't every company just do it tomorrow? Here's a mechanic built directly into the pricing, not an accident. Egress. Getting data into a cloud provider is free, or close enough that nobody notices. Getting your own data back out to another provider or back on premises is where the meter turns on hard. Egress fees can reportedly run around $90,000 per petabyte moved out. That rate is volume tiered, dropping as a company moves more data, so it isn't a flat toll for everyone. It's also not permanent. Since 2024, AWS, matching a policy Google already had and one Azure adopted under EU regulatory pressure, reportedly waives egress fees entirely for a full, clean exit. AWS reportedly waived around $250,000 in egress fees for 37 signals itself as part of the departure covered earlier, so the toll booth isn't absolute. Leave completely, and the fee can disappear. But here's what keeps it standing for most companies. The survey mentioned earlier found the large majority planning repatriation, reportedly around 92%, are only moving some workloads, not making a full break. Partial, selective repatriation generally still gets billed in full. For a company sitting on even a handful of petabytes of logs, backups, and user files, that fee alone can run into the millions before a dollar gets spent on replacement infrastructure. The mechanic is real, it's just not absolute. And for the roughly 9 in 10 companies only leaving partway, it's still a huge part of why they haven't finished the job. Leaving a major cloud provider is not something a company decides on a Monday and finishes by Friday, no matter how good the spreadsheet looks. First, there's the egress bill itself, the fee just to move your own data out the door, which can run into 6 or 7 figures before anything else has even started. Then there's buying or leasing physical servers, which someone has to rack, wire, cool, power, and physically secure, either in a building the company owns or a co-location facility it now has to manage an ongoing relationship with. Then there's rebuilding every piece of automation built around a specific cloud provider's tools, deployment scripts, monitoring dashboards, backup schedules, security policies, none of which just transfers over cleanly to a different environment. And then there's hiring or training, the actual people who know how to keep physical infrastructure running at 2 in the morning when something breaks, because the cloud provider isn't doing that job in the background anymore. Companies that pull this off successfully typically spend 1 to several years planning it in detail before they ever flip the switch. Here's the part that doesn't make it into the excited headlines about companies fleeing the cloud. Repatriation is not automatically the smart move for every company, and treating it like a universal fix is genuinely a mistake. If a business's traffic is spiky and unpredictable, a seasonal retailer around the holidays, an app that might go viral overnight, anything where demand can jump 10 times over in a matter of hours, the cloud's ability to instantly scale computing power up and back down again is genuinely hard to replace with owned hardware. Owned servers either sit mostly idle, costing money while doing nothing, or they fall over completely during the 1 week a company actually needs the extra capacity. Repatriation tends to make the most financial sense for large, steady, predictable workloads, the kind companies like Dropbox, 37 Signals, and GEICO already had, running huge, steady operations for years before making any move, where a company already knows roughly what it will need next year. For a small team, an early stage product, or any business with wildly variable demand, The cloud's flexibility is often still worth every dollar it costs. This is a real financial and technical trade-off with legitimate arguments on both sides, not a trend worth copying just because a few large, well-funded companies did it. So, to bring it all together, companies like 37 Signals, Dropbox, and Geico didn't leave the cloud because it's broken or because renting servers was a bad idea to begin with. They left because, at their specific scale with steady and predictable workloads, owning infrastructure ended up cheaper than continuing to pay for it indefinitely. And they got there despite an egress fee structure that, for most companies attempting anything short of a full exit, still makes leaving expensive by design. Whether that same math applies to any other company still depends almost entirely on how predictable its workload is and how much data it's built up over the years. None of this is an argument against cloud computing in general. It's a reminder that the cheapest option when you're small isn't always the cheapest option once you've grown. If you found this useful, save it for the next time someone brings up a cloud bill in a meeting and follow along for more stories like this one.